Welcome, everybody. We're here for another edition of Legend Sports Amplify, where we're talking baseball history, Negro League history, sports history, you name it, everything in between. So I am really happy to have with us this afternoon Leslie Heaphy. How are you, Leslie?
I'm just great. Thanks for having me.
All right, this is great. We were talking before we got on here about what I'm trying to do with this and get all of the people who have done so much work and put in so much time and dedication to some of these projects, particularly the Negro Leagues, like yourself and Phil Dixon and Bob Kendrick and Kevin Mitchell, Larry Lester, you name it. The list goes on and on. Unfortunately, it's not as long as it should be because
True.
and uh, today was another. Well, yesterday actually was another announcement that Baseball Reference is now going to be listing the Negro League statistics as part of their database, and you were involved in a little bit in that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, and we'll talk about your backstory and go into your work as well.
Sure. So, Baseball Reference acquired the statistics from CNEDs, and in part of their effort was they wanted to be able to put the stats into some kind of context so people could understand a little bit more about how the Negro Leagues operated, worked, what the what the bigger story was beyond just the numbers. And so I was one of the people that they asked to write an article to sort of help put it in context. So I wrote about the role that women played in the Negro Leagues as owners and players, um, specifically during those 7 seasons, but also just to make people aware that it's much broader than that. And I also got a chance to see the site before it went live as well and offer my thoughts and opinions, which was kind of fun.
Cool, kind of like a beta tester kind of thing.
Yes. Yep. That's what we were. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. I think that you know. I told you briefly about this, but last year was the 100th anniversary of the Negro National League, and now with the amplification of all this, with Major League Baseball first making the announcement around Christmas time, and now with this, I just think this is some great momentum that people can get a little bit more familiar with it and provide the context, because that's, I think, what so many people are not I don't know if they're not getting, they're just not aware of it. But when I've been talking to people over the years, everybody wants to put the Negro Leagues into that nice box of 162 game schedule and league leaders and
Mhm.
standings, and in some years it is that, but there's more to it than that, and that's why the work that all of you have been doing for such a long time on this is so important. And I think provided the context that Major League Baseball and Baseball Reference and other places were looking for um, as validation. Not that they needed the validation; they
Right.
were major leagues, but uh,
Absolutely.
you have to have without the statistics, and there's still work going on with that. There needed to be an element of you know clarity there that puts it all kind of in context and perspective. So I was telling you,
For
I
sure.
love, and I tell this to everybody, I love origin stories. So what is yours? You've been with Saber for since the '80s, right?
Yeah, I joined Sabre in 1989 when I was in grad school, actually. Um, I was working on my master's thesis on Negro League Baseball,
Oh,
and I went searching for anybody that could help me and discovered Sabre and discovered Larry Lester and Dick Clark and Jim Riley and John Holloway and that whole group. So I've known them since
oh
1989.
wow.
But I got started, as I said, working on it for my master's thesis. And it's a story that I have told a lot of times, but it's kind of an interesting one. I was taking a labor history seminar and we had to pick a topic. And so I was literally in the library, walking up and down, looking at, because it wasn't exactly an area that I was thrilled about it, but it was a course I had to take. So I was in the library, walking up and down the bookshelves, looking for something that might interest me. And I thought, hmm, child labor, that sounds kind of cool. I guess I could do something on that. Well, one of my colleagues came by. He was a PhD student at the time, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, what would you want to do?" And I said, "Well, something with baseball, but they'll never let me." And his simple comment was, "Why not?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just assumed they wouldn't let me do it." So I went and to my advisor and said, "I'd love to do something about this league that I don't know anything about." And he said, "There's labor in that. Why not?" And I've been doing it ever since.
I mean, and so we're talking. This is mid '80s, late '80s.
Yeah, 88, 89. It
Boy, oh
was, yep.
boy.
And it literally was him just saying to me, "Why not?" And I went, "Oh, I don't know. I just assumed." I hadn't really thought of, because I didn't know anybody that was doing anything like that. So I
Hmm.
just assumed you couldn't do it.
Yeah, and that's like I said. Unfortunately, I wish there were more people who were, but the people who have been able to keep this going and keep the legacy and the stories alive. I mean, boy, oh boy, I tell everybody, just hats off to you guys because it's been a long journey to get to where we finally got in the last couple of months. So um,
But it's been fun. It's a
I can
fun journey.
imagine. I can imagine. So the baseball reference, now that it's including all the Negro League statistics, one of the things that I told you some of the crazy things I've heard over the years. The woke left, and that's the only
Hmm.
reason why this is happening, kind of thing. But the other thing I get a lot of pushback on is, and people just not understanding, is they've heard the stories and read whatever they've read, and the Josh Gibson had 900 home runs
Right.
and you name it, and they just thought that you know now he's going to be replacing Babe Ruth and Barry Bonds at the top of these lists, and they're not understanding that no, it's only going to be um, the Negro National League, Negro Southern League, five other leagues, seven leagues, I believe, um,
Right.
that are between the years of 1920 and 1948,
48.
right?
Yep.
So what kind of impact are we going to see there?
Well, you're going to see some changes, certainly. But I think your main point there is what you're not going to immediately see is Satchel Paige isn't going to jump to the top of the list. Josh Gibson is,
Yeah.
because the important idea here is it only includes official league game statistics,
Hmm.
the same way Major League Baseball does.
Hmm.
And so, consequently, in most seasons, that's only about 80 games,
Hmm.
maybe 85. The rest of the games they're playing are barnstorming games, even though sometimes those barnstorming games might be the Homestead Grays playing the Philadelphia Stars, right? Who are both
Hmm.
major Negro League teams,
Hmm.
but they played exhibition games maybe the day after they played a league game. So those don't count in these statistics. Now, can you find those statistics? Sure. But as far as what we're talking about here, so what you're going to see is rather than many of them moving to the top of the leaderboards, they're going to be in the leaderboards,
Hmm.
right? And so you're going to see Mill Suttles up there for his on base percentage. You're going to see Josh Gibson. You're going to see Satchel Paige with the ERA, things like that. But in most cases, they're not going to overtake the leaders. So people don't have to, it's just not going to be a wholesale switching of the entire, simply because of the number of games that are included.
Hmm.
But the important thing is they're going to be there.
Right.
And as they should be, and as we've always known that they were, that now everybody will know. And the most important part is somebody's going to see a name like, uh, let's go past the Josh Gibsons, and even Mule Suttles is not somebody, and they're going to see a name like George Mule Suttles and wonder, who on earth is that? I've never
Right.
heard of him, which is
Bullet
great.
Rogan. Bullet
Yeah.
Rogan was a great one. I saw where he has a combined WAR of like 60 because he has 30 some as a hitter and
Mm-hmm.
20 some as a pitcher or something like that. I
Yep.
don't remember the exact number, but that was very cool to see that because
Yep.
that was another element that these players brought, where many of them were fantastic pitchers,
Yep.
and they
Well,
also,
somebody like Double Duty Radcliffe,
yeah.
who would catch a doubleheader and pitch the other game. I mean, that's just not something you see among most major league players.
No.
Certainly not today, but even in the past. And so these are the kinds of things that are going to add to the overall story. And yes, it's going to change slightly, stats for people like Willie Mays and Jackie Robinson and others who started in the Negro Leagues. Those numbers, if they started before 48, so there are a few of them,
Mm-hmm.
those numbers are now going to count as well.
Mm-hmm. And marginally, I saw where
Yeah,
Hank Aaron's going to get a few more hits and maybe
sure.
another home
Yep.
run or two, but
Yeah.
we're not talking
No.
wholesale changes.
No.
But it's the recognition that they deserve, and that was another thing I mentioned to you before we got started too was the Josh Gibson MVP, and I have no, I mean, the three people who I've heard were being considered, Branch Rickey, Frank Robinson, Josh Gibson, any one of them would be worthy to put on an
Absolutely.
award like that, of course. But the significance of Josh Gibson, it's not just because of his accomplishments alone. It's more of a the significance of what he represents in those 3,400
Right.
and however many players that never got the opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too in these discussions I've been trying to have with people outside of this too is no one is saying every single person who played in the Negro Leagues and in black baseball were major league caliber.
No,
That,
of
no,
course not.
of course not, right? But look at the implications there, and it's really hard to put on it. But that meant that if they were not allowed to play, that some portion of Major League Baseball was not was AAA talent as
Absolutely.
well, right?
Of
So
course.
how do you quantify that? I mean, that's beyond my ability,
Right.
but there is a significant portion, and so what happened? It took away from a lot of things. I mean, it basically that color barrier, uh, you know, stole a lot from not just our the game's history, but American history. But it is what it is, right? I mean, it
Right.
happened, and all you can do now is try to raise awareness of it, and
Well,
uh,
and explain to people why it happened,
mm-hmm,
what it meant, and as you point out, what the consequences were.
yes,
And those consequences are wide and broad, and people don't get that. And one of the things I've found over the years is that using something like baseball to talk about the racism, the prejudice in this country is a great way to get people to realize it in ways they might not otherwise
that's right.
because they're just not paying attention. But you talk to them about it through a lens that they understand. And they're like, oh wow, I never thought about it. And they're like, and I'm like, and so think about the consequences then on the larger society. You can think about it from the economics, right? And the list goes on and on. And suddenly you've opened up a door
Yeah,
to a much broader story
that's right.
that you don't get without including the Negro Leagues and then black baseball as a larger whole.
That's right. So I mentioned to you every single day I try to put something out on Twitter and some other places, other forums. What this kind of the significance of the Negro Leagues has been, and what I've grown to learn over the years is the impact it had in every corner of the country.
Oh,
It was more than just the Negro Leagues and like you mentioned, the 80 maybe game schedules that they were playing. They were playing and bringing a brand of baseball to every
oh
corner
yeah.
of the continent, really. And that, I think, is an underappreciated element.
I think people have no idea,
Mm-hmm.
um, both in some of these small places, but just in general, that you can't really go almost anywhere and not discover that there was
Yep.
either a black baseball team at one time there or black baseball teams traveled through their area and played.
Yep.
I live in Ohio now, and we've got some small southern towns like Zanesville, Ohio, which is a teeny little town, and Zanesville saw many Negro League teams come through there, including the apocryphal story of Josh Gibson hitting 4 home runs in one game in that little stadium. I say apocryphal because we're not exactly sure. Haven't found the box score to back it up, but he did play there. And so suddenly you've got this teeny little town that says, wait a second, we had who and who is that person? And
Yep.
now suddenly he's getting all this, and he was here. How did he get here? And why were they here when Zanesville is a primarily white community, as many of these small towns are? And so suddenly you've got a story just from knowing that they passed through.
That's right. And think about that, right? Uh, this kind of light bulb went off on me the other day when I was talking to Larry Lester about this. Was um, not only did they go to all these small towns, people were paying money.
Yeah.
And money is hard to come by. And in some of these decades, we're talking through the Depression and then through
Hmm.
World War II and various other times in our country when if you had a hard-earned dollar, you were careful where you were spending it. But yet
And
there were a lot of people going to see these guys
yeah.
play. That had to mean
Oh, yeah.
something. Yes.
Well, I mean, think about this. So think about this is where I think you can really show that the East West All Star game, right?
Yeah.
Played in Comiskey Park. A number of the years that they played, they outdrew the white Major League All Star game.
Hmm.
To your point about how people were willing to spend their money,
That's right. And they played
more
two.
people
They even played two of them.
yeah, but more people were willing to go to Comiskey Park
Yep.
to see the Negro Leaguers play
Yeah.
than the white Major Leaguers.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I like I said, I just think more people need to know the context and the backstory and more about all this because it's definitely underappreciated and it's unfortunate what happened,
Mm-hmm.
um, but that needs to be highlighted as well. It's part of our country's history, and that's something that you made a great point about baseball being maybe a way to bring some of these topics up.
Mm-hmm.
When I talked to Andrew Moranis the other day, he had his book about Glenn Burke, the first
Right.
openly gay baseball player. He has his book about the first Olympic basketball tournament game
Mm-hmm.
played in 1936 under fascism in Nazi Germany,
Right.
and so he said exactly those same thing that sometimes you can use sports to have a way to bring up other topics in a less threatening way, maybe, and get people
Yeah.
to have a
Well,
conversation.
I teach a sports history class. I teach a Negro Leagues history class, and that's exactly what we do. And people invariably, my students will say, "Wow, I never wait. We're learning history at the same time." I'm like, "Of course," and they
Cool,
just have
right?
never thought about it. I'm like, "Do you not think the Great Depression or World War I, World War II, the Spanish American War, the Civil, they all had impacts on, and the sports had impacts on them." I said, and sort of put it in context for my current students, right? I
Hmm.
said, well, think about what happened after 9/11. And, baseball teams stopped playing. And so there was an impact. And then they chose the way they were going to come back to the field. And so that was in, I said, these things have happened forever.
Uh-huh. They have. So we'll segue there a little bit because one of the books that you've written, the Encyclopedia of Women's Baseball, to me is pretty fascinating because not only does it go into, because I think many people would look at that and think that it's just the history of the All
All
American girls.
American League?
Yeah, and that they're in there, right?
Sure, they are. Yeah.
But a couple of, I want to say it was maybe 2 months ago, just in doing some digging. Every day I try to do a little bit of amateur sleuthing myself, digging around on newspapers.com or wherever, trying to find something interesting to put out there. And I've come
Mm-hmm.
across some crazy things and some interesting things and some fun things. But one of the things I came across, and this was after I had spoken with uh, Todd Peterson and Pete Gorton, and they did all that work on
On
baseball up in
John.
Minnesota, and then on John Donaldson and so forth. So I was digging around looking for things about the John Donaldson and the Kansas City Monarchs, and I came across first um, the fact that J.O. Wilkinson was so far ahead of his time as
Yes,
an
he was.
owner when it came to what he was doing, but he had his first team had women on it, which fascinated me. What was her name? It was
Well, you're talking about Carrie
uh,
Nation,
Carrie
the
Nation. There you go.
Carrie Nation. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then when I found Carrie Nation, I had to do a little bit more digging, and then I came across so many things that, man, if you could just touch on some of these, because I came across people like Jackie Mitchell
Mm-hmm.
and Lizzie Murphy and Elizabeth Stroud, and I'm trying to think of who else, and the Bloomer Girls, and
Yeah.
knowing that Rogers Hornsby played and Tris Speaker were playing with the Bloomer Girls, which I don't think
Yep.
people would ever even
Oh,
equate
no,
that.
no, they certainly would not.
and
But
and
well,
then to tie the two of those together, you also did an another book that was about Negro League Baseball history. And
Mhm.
so I also came across the Dolly Vardens of Philadelphia, which goes back to the 1860s in women's
Eight-
baseball.
1880s, actually.
1880s. Okay.
Well, that's one of those myths that
Okay.
there's a picture floating around out there that has caused, and for a while we did think that the Dolly Varden's team of the 1860s was a women's team. Turns out it was a men's team.
Really?
And the women's team comes along in 1883. And the picture that everybody keeps posting and publishing about the Dolly Vardens is actually a YWCA team from the 1920s. There is
Wow.
no picture of the Dolly Vardens that anybody has
It seemed
discovered
it
to
seemed
date.
it seemed incredulous to me too that someone would have snapped that picture from 1880. But
Right. Thank you. That's
yeah.
You didn't have to think too hard to
Yeah.
realize that that picture had to be later than.
Yeah.
Uh, but the Dolly Vardens are a women's. There were two Dolly Varden women's baseball teams, Black Waist, playing in Philadelphia in 1883, along with a third team that played in the same city called also women's team called the Captain Jinks. And so we have three Black women's baseball teams playing in the city of Philadelphia in 1883. Now,
Wow.
how good were they, et cetera? That's a tough thing to get our hands around, but it doesn't matter. They were playing. They were there. And, you're talking
Interesting.
about the Negro League stories not being told. Well, women's baseball is even less well
I'm
known
sure.
because most everybody, their only point of reference is the movie A League of Their Own. And they know about the All American League and
Ah,
think that
that's
that's the
right.
whole story.
That's
And
right.
it's like, that is about this much of the story. It's an important part of the story for sure, but it is not the whole story.
I'm going to put up while we're talking here that web page I told you about. At least it lists your
Yep.
books. The baseball guru site, just so people can see them and what we're talking about here. So
Mhm.
there's the Encyclopedia of Women and Baseball. So you that came out in summer of 2006. So what else can we find in that? I think I probably mentioned a few of the names that are in there, but
Well, you're going to find everything from the some of the names you mentioned, but we've so you got talking about the bloomer teams of the early 20th century, but they're preceded by a group of women's teams called the Reds and the Blues, and it literally was the belts on their uniforms were either red or blue, and so they wore. And so that's 19th century. You've got women's college baseball teams in the 19th century. The Vassar Resolutes is kind of where that
interesting.
starts, but there are so many others. And then not only do you have players, but you have Amanda Clement, for example, first female umpire in 1905. Thank you very much. She
Wow.
umpired for a number of seasons and paid her way through college from the money she made umpiring. Right. Sadly, she starts in 1905, and we've still only had 7 or 8 female umpires to the present day, and none of them at the major league level, but they're all in there. Um, you,
Wow.
One of my favorite players of the very early period is a young lady by the name of Alta Weiss, who played in Ohio. Her dad was a doctor. She ended up becoming a doctor. She wanted to play baseball, so her dad basically bought her a team so that she could play. And she was the pitcher
Wow.
for the team. And they changed the name and they became the Weiss All Stars. And she was the centerpiece. You have a name like Maud Nelson. Maud Nelson, currently there's a campaign underway. It's just starting to try to pull together all the incredible details of her career to try to push to get her into the Hall of Fame. She would be then, if we
Wow.
could do it, the second woman ever, since Effa Manley certainly is in
That's right.
there. And there's your Negro League connection. So
Yeah.
Effa Manley, owner, she's in there. But
Okay.
there's a whole
Cool.
series of owners. And it starts with Helene Britton, who owned the St. Louis Cardinals in the 19 teens.
And I guarantee you nobody knew that.
No. And then as far as the Negro Leagues go, everybody talks about Effa Manley. Yes, Effa Manley is in the Hall of Fame. But the very first female Negro League owner is Olivia Taylor in 1922 and
That's
1923
right.
and 1924.
C.I. Taylor's
Yes.
wife, right? After he
Yeah.
passed away. That's right.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. And so the encyclopedia includes all of these. It also includes some international as well, because women's
Awesome.
baseball has been played all around the world.
Very, very cool. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these are the types of stories that I really, I think people need
Well, I'm
to hear
hoping
more about.
I'm finishing up a new edition of it because, as you said, it's been almost 15 years since it came
Hmm.
out. And so lots has happened. I've learned lots. In fact, the new edition will probably be a multi-volume one. At least that's what we're expecting,
Cool.
which will really shock people to discover there's that much history about women's baseball.
I bet. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. Since it was 15 years ago on this, uh, just like we just talked about with that picture floating around, do you come across? I mean, probably quite often. You think something is true today,
Mm-hmm.
and then next week or next year or whenever it
Oh, yeah,
happens to
it
be,
happens all the time. But that's what good research is all about.
that's right.
It's there's a difference, but as I tell
And
my students all the time, there's a difference between somebody making a mistake and us not knowing at the time. We put
yeah,
out Good researchers put out what we know to be the best information we have at the moment,
that's a
and then
great point.
it can be corrected. And
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that necessarily it wasn't a mistake. That's not to say there aren't mistakes made, but that's not
Yes,
to say all of them are mistakes. Research is an ongoing, and it should be, right? So the Negro League stats that we have right now are going to continue to change as we continue to fill in the gaps and the missing games. And so a game here, a game there, those all, and they change. And that's okay. That's the way it should be. Otherwise,
that's right.
we would be done.
That's right. That's I mean that's a great point. And I think I brought this up a few times with other guests as well. Is just because something you know that you printed, worked on at a certain point in time, and now you new information comes to light. It doesn't make, like you said, that wrong. It just means that you've got a clearer picture on it. It reminded me kind of like, you're doing archaeology and you find some dinosaur bones, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
maybe you find out later on they had feathers and whatever, right? I mean, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that
No,
what you found, those original bones, were not necessarily the truth. And I think
it's the best. You can only make a story the best it can be based
mhm,
on what you have at that moment. And as long as you're a good researcher and you have done your homework, then you can honestly say you have put out what was the best information at that moment.
I bet you
Now,
that
if you
makes
haven't
a
researched, then that's not what you can say, right?
that's
But if
right.
you have, and then the best thing about it though is you can also then track the research skills of other people. Are they copying those old stories or are they aware of the new stories?
That's a good point.
And
So
that's how things unfortunately get perpetuated.
that's exactly right. Yeah. So this book, was this your first one that you put out? This Negro Leagues
The Negro Leagues,
1869?
yeah, this is the first one. Yep. And it's,
2002.
yeah, and that was when it came out in hardcover and it came out in paperback a number of years later. And they've asked me to work on a updated version of this one as well. So I'm working on that also since
And so
to our point, lots has changed.
that's right. So what did you cover in this book? The early teams, players, leagues. That sort of was it
I've
broad,
covered
high
everything
level?
from the start in the 19th century up to the end in 1960. It was something that had not been done in a really comprehensive fashion since Bob Peterson's book came out, Only the Ball Was White, which was
Hmm.
in 1970. And so the
That was
books in
my first one.
between had focused on bits and pieces of, but I tried to take a more comprehensive look. And Dick Clark and Larry Lester had done the Negro Leagues records book in 1994, and that certainly looked, but that focused much more on the stat side of things, which is
Hmm.
not necessarily what I do. I leave that to them. um, I'm much more interested in the stories in the larger as a historian, since that's the historical context. One of the cool things that I did include in that book, which at that time was also pretty new, was because I read Spanish, I was able to include a significant section on their play in Latin America
Cool.
from using the newspapers in Latin America rather than just the English accounts on our side of things, which was that was a lot of fun and not something that had really been done before.
Now that's interesting. What did you find any differences in the narratives that were going on in both places? Or
Well,
I'm gonna go
the
ahead and put you
yeah,
back on here.
sure. The biggest difference in the narrative was the way the players talked about how they felt in Latin America,
Oh yeah.
and how the newspapers covered them and the language that was used. And so, we hear the stories, and this shouldn't surprise people, I would hope, that many of the Negro League players who went south of the border found for the first time
Mm-hmm.
an acceptance that they never got here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That they felt like, I think it was Willie Wells who said, for the first time, I felt like a man instead of a boy. I got
Mm-hmm.
treated like a true human being. And the newspaper coverage reflected that. It talked about them in a very different way. A lot of the newspaper coverage in the 20s and 30s would use words that I'm not even going to use now because we wouldn't use them today, right? And you can think
Mm-hmm.
about beyond um, talking about them in ways that were derogatory,
Mm-hmm.
using their skin color and all of. You don't see that in the Latin American newspaper coverage. They just talk about them as ball players, and
Mm-hmm.
they talk about their skills on the field, and there's almost no references to the kinds of comments that you would see in American newspapers. And so that's a big difference in the narrative.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I know I've read some of those accounts myself, and it's no wonder why many of them enjoyed their time down there better than they
Yeah,
did here. They didn't have to worry about all the Jim Crow and
right,
segregation that was going on here. You can actually live like a normal human being, and
exactly.
that really is it's a shame that we were at that point in our history.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to learn from it. That's the thing. You can't shy away from it. That's some of the things that's been going on with education. And you being a teacher, you probably understand this pretty well. My wife is a teacher, elementary school, grade school, and in certain states, certain things are taught certain ways, and I don't think shying away from things makes it better. I mean, at
It
some point you
All it
have to
does is it means that
kicks the
you've tried
can,
to
right?
pick it. Well, it kicks the can down the road, but it also says you don't get to pick and choose which parts of history you want to talk
Hmm.
about and which ones you don't.
Hmm.
I mean, that's not the way it works. And so you have to talk about it all if you want to understand it, because otherwise, using again the Negro Leagues as a picture, if you just look at Major League Baseball, minor league baseball, you get one picture.
Hmm.
When you include the Negro Leagues, when you include the women players, when you include other minority groups that have been, you get an entirely different picture. And then you have to understand, well, why did that happen? And then you get an entirely different understanding of American history as a whole.
Hmm.
And that's not to go back and accuse people or any of those kind of things, which you hear all the time. No,
Yeah,
it's simply that's what happened.
it is.
And we can't gloss it over and act like it didn't happen, because then we don't understand why things are the way they are today.
That's exactly right. It's a good point. So, one of the topics I had wanted to talk to you about originally, but then things have changed since I first reached out to you a while back. But was about the significance of Rube Foster and
Mm-hmm.
the growth of black baseball, and the founding of the Negro National League in 1920. And I know you were involved in that book about black baseball in Chicago. And
Mm-hmm. Yep.
so I'm sure I have not read it, but what can you tell us about that work? Because it seems to me like it would have, if it's, I mean, Chicago was kind of the.
Well, Chicago was the centerpiece, really.
Mhm.
When we think about the founding of the Negro National League in 1920, the actual meeting where they signed the papers and all of it took place in Kansas City, right? And that's why the museum is in Kansas City. But the centerpiece of the league was in Chicago.
Mhm.
And most of the reason for that is because of Rube Foster, because Rube Foster left Texas, went to Philadelphia, and then ended up in Chicago and basically built his career there. And Foster uses the benefits of that big city, a city that was very sports crazy, had all kinds of sports going on, had a significantly growing black population because of the Great Migration that started.
Hmm.
Oh, Pittsburgh the same way. But what you have in Chicago is the bringing together of the right people, meaning Foster, a baseball mad town or sports mad town, lots of stadiums, a growing black population, a major black newspaper, Chicago Defender, that had
Hmm.
both local edition and national, so that you could pull together all of these pieces to create a league that this was not a new idea. They tried back as early as 1887 to create
Hmm.
a Black League, and there have been 4 or 5 attempts since then. Two others in Chicago prior to 1920, as a matter of fact. But Foster really was, in many ways, the missing piece. And then the growing black population. And so you put those pieces together, and what you see in 1920 is the creation of a league that's finally going to last.
Hmm.
And it starts something that obviously lasts then with various iterations of leagues through to 1960. And so what Foster and Chicago and the teams in Chicago, his own Chicago American Giants, the Chicago Union Giants, the Chicago Giants, there were just so many teams there. They laid a foundation for the Negro Leagues itself, building off a foundation of obviously those who played before them. But that's, and so the book on Chicago and Black baseball talks about Foster and his involvement, but it also talks about all these other teams and some of the key players who made Chicago their home, the number of teams. Chicago sits in just such a great place for teams to travel through, going to Kansas City and
Hmm.
St. Louis and other way. And then, of course, the East West Classic ultimately ends up the main one being played at Comiskey Park. So once
Hmm.
again, Chicago is the centerpiece. And so for from the 1930s through the end of the 1940s, you're going to have the biggest black baseball showcase event taking place at Comiskey Park.
And you had a combination on top of that, like you said, the pieces were all in place, and the man who was at the helm of the ship
Yes,
was a man who, he could have been a Hall of Fame caliber player, general manager, a writer, a field manager. He did it
that
all, and,
that's what
and
was so unique about Foster.
yes.
He That's why he was the right person, right?
Hmm.
He was a player. He was an outstanding pitcher. He was a manager. He was an owner.
Hmm.
He was an executive.
Hmm.
He was a writer.
Hmm.
There's not a title that you can't attach to Foster's name.
And so I think that's what gave him the understanding of
Mm-hmm.
all of the elements that go into how to make this work over time. I mean, I'm sure, like you said, there was trial and error. They
Yeah.
tried, it failed, it didn't work, things didn't work out,
Yeah.
but he learned and he
Well, when he took on Frank Leland and took him to court
that's crazy to
to
me. Can you
to
talk about
secure
that?
the sure. Well,
Yeah.
so Foster originally played for Frank Leland,
Hmm.
and Leland was a big baseball man in Chicago. And what Foster figured out was that Leland was making more money than the players were, and they were clearly not getting their fair share.
Hmm.
So he challenged Leland on that idea, and then decided that he wanted to take it a step further, and that was to create his own team, and he wanted to use the name. And so he actually takes Leland to court to be able to use the name the Chicago American Giants, and he wins.
He steals his
And he
own
ends
name off of him.
he,
That's
he
crazy to
ends
me.
up being, and so Leland has to stay with the Leland Giants.
Hmm.
Well, Foster's become the Chicago American Giants,
Hmm.
and that's the team that enters the Negro National League and continues to play for the next 20 plus years, all because of Foster and Foster willing to and go to court in the 19 teens
Hmm. And because of
and win.
all those elements of understanding, he not only understood all of the components to trying to run and put together and run and manage a successful team, he also kind of knew the way the fans thought. Because one of the things that I found out that kind of blew me away, he was so on top of the pulse of things that he transferred players from his own team to other teams in order to
Hmm.
make them more competitive, knowing that if he put a better brand on the field in the long run, it would help not just the league, but his own team and
Right.
ultimately him. And that's just brilliant to me.
Well, Foster understood. Well, here's the thing: you can put out the greatest team in the world on your own, but if you don't have opponents to play,
Mm-hmm.
what's the point, right? And
Yep.
and so you needed to have a marketplace. You needed to have the other opponents. But to be fair, Foster also was not above using it, understanding his own team and his own business.
Mm-hmm.
So, because one of the things he was accused of by many of the other owners, rightly so, in the newspapers. This was one of the fun things about the 1920s in particular. Today, if we were having a conversation and we had an argument, we would just have the argument. They would have the arguments in the newspaper. So he and C.I. Taylor had an ongoing battle that they just wrote in the newspaper. And one of the issues was that Foster, because he set the schedule for the league as well, would make sure that he had the best teams coming into Chicago on the weekends because that's when you're going to
Sure.
make the most money. And he would want to be in Kansas City on a weeknight or weekend, not a weeknight. And so he was not above,
A little manipulation. Yeah.
but yeah, but even doing that, that benefited the other teams as well. But
Mm-hmm.
some of the other owners thought he took unfair advantage of his position at times.
But then it's always interesting. I read some of the, um, I guess it was his son had kept a scrapbook of
Mm-hmm.
all of the. And I don't know if it's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I
It
believe it
is.
is, but you can go back and read everything that was collected over the decades that his son
Yep.
had kept, and it's fascinating stuff because it's newspaper clippings and
Mm-hmm.
and writing from that day that it happened, and it's very very cool. But um, when he did get that little bit of pushback, and he came back at them and said, "Well, go find somebody else." They all ultimately came back and said, "Okay,
Yeah.
Rube, you're okay. You do your thing."
Well, well, they were smart enough to realize
Hmm.
that Foster brought some things, many things to the table that the rest of them did not. And that was a, the ability to look at baseball in its entirety, every aspect of it, and understand it in a way that none of the rest of them seem to be able to do. And so, because we know what happens when
Hmm.
Foster ultimately gets sick and ends up in the hospital and leaves the league, it doesn't last long after Foster. And
No.
yes, the Great Depression comes along as well, but it's on its last legs even before that. And most of that, well, Foster's gone. You don't have that very strong guiding hand at the top.
Yeah, that's true. That is a good point. One of the things you mentioned too about the black press at the time, and there were some very very large circulation newspapers in cities like you mentioned, Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, um,
Mm-hmm.
Baltimore. What role did they play in all of this? Because some of the articles I've read, there were some were supportive, some were critical of the way things were being handled as far as the Negro Leagues went.
Sure. Well, the black newspapers just overall played an absolutely critical role to the success of the Negro Leagues because one of the things that I think is true is when you look to some of the most successful Negro League teams, the Monarchs, the Chicago teams, the Pittsburgh teams, right? They're all in cities that had large black newspapers. Cities that didn't, teams tended to struggle a bit more and
Mm-hmm.
not be as solid, or teams came in and out and they would change names. And so, just from that standpoint, the newspapers played a huge role. Obviously, from the standpoint of researchers today, we couldn't do what we do
That's
without
right.
what the black newspapers did. But they also played a role, I think, to sort of what you were saying, as both a chronicler. So they gave us the details, the specifics, they told those stories, but they were not above also recognizing that they had a role to play on the on the social side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so many of them used their voices and this audience that they had to not be above saying you could do better. we need to do better. And we're going to criticize you when you're not,
Hmm.
because they recognized the role that Black baseball played in so many of these communities. You know, Janet Bruce, when she wrote her book many years ago on the Kansas City Monarchs, one of her focuses was on how the Monarchs were viewed by the community as something to look up to, something to be proud of, right?
Hmm.
And so many of the Black writers recognized that role and said, if that's the role and people, then we have to do our best. We have to put our best, and we're not going to be above calling you out on that. Today, unfortunately, some people see some of those criticisms and don't see it that way. They just see it as, oh, see, we told you they weren't organized.
Ah,
But
yeah.
but you have to look at it in the context of the time period and realize, no, in many cases, what they were saying was, you could do better. You need to fix these things. We need to be
Wow.
able to show that we can do these things, and if we can do this, then again, in the context of that day, then maybe they'll let us do something else,
And
right?
that's a great point because that's why context is important and why it matters. You have to understand the thought process and the mindset of what you're reading. You can't just because like
It's
you
not
said, you could look at it as a criticism, and like you said, I'm sure there's many people who took it that way. Oh yeah, see,
absolutely,
yeah.
and and so it changes the way you look at it and say, okay, why would they do that? Well, if you understand the context of how white America looked at Black America, not to give a big history, but
Hmm.
Booker T. Washington, the accommodationist, said we've got to show them that before they'll let us do things, right?
Hmm.
And so there's always this idea and so to some degree that's where some of that criticism is coming from. Now at the same time, when we move into the 30s and 40s, the Black newspapers play an enormous role in pushing for integration and trying to push both the Black community and the white community to say, this has to end. We need to see integration. And
Hmm.
Wendell Smith, Lester Rodney, Joe Bostic, Sam Lacey, they're all involved in that effort. And they play a crucial role. They had the voice. They are the ones that people are reading and listening to. And then when baseball does integrate, this is where it gets into it, because some of those Black reporters then are criticized for basically saying they abandoned the Negro Leagues, right? They started
Hmm.
because they were covering Jackie Robinson, they're covering Larry Doby in the
Hmm.
major leagues. And of course, if you follow their train of thought, this is what they were pushing for was integration. And
Hmm.
so when it happens, you're not going to turn your back on that and say, oh, now we're not going to cover it.
That's right.
You need to make people aware of
You're all
and
in.
promote those. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that they were necessarily thinking that the Negro Leagues, that they were abandoning them, but it's a process that they were following. And if you want integration to succeed, just like you wanted the Negro Leagues to succeed, then you have to give them coverage.
Hmm. it, some of these things you're saying, just as context, I love going back and looking at old newspapers because it just gives you such
Oh, it does.
a good insight into what was going on. But I read an article the other day and I posted it on Twitter about boy, I can't remember the writer's name, but it was in a Baltimore newspaper. He was talking about how what is going on with black baseball. The youth is not playing it,
Oh, yeah.
and he's talking about how now they're into boxing and they're into jazz music and they're into and and what really struck me about that was not only the article itself and what he was talking about, but how here we are almost 100, because this was like 1936 or something when that article was. Now we fast forward 100 years today, and we're kind of in that same, um,
We are.
window where how do you and it's even harder today because you've got so many outside. You've got more sports, you've got more professional sports you could play. Baseball sometimes, and to me, baseball has become the clubhouse, or the sort of set because people are, you know, travel teams and you have to pay money, and
Well,
it
there's
just
the
makes
problem. Yeah.
there's some
I
things that
mean,
need to change with that. But it
It's
is.
become a sport that unless you have money,
Mm-hmm.
you can't play.
Yes, like golf used to be, right?
Hmm.
But it just was interesting that 100 years ago they already could see that coming, and here we are. And anyway, yeah, the context is so important. And the other thing, I read an article that you had written about. Now we're into the radio and television era, and
Hmm.
are there any broadcasts that you know of that were ever recorded that you can listen to from Negro League baseball games? I found a reference from 1942 on
Right.
WWDC
Hmm.
for a Grays game. Can you? I wonder if you could find them anywhere.
There are very few. We've found bits and pieces here and there, and there's a couple of them that are you can find at the Library of Congress, but
Okay.
they are few and far between, unfortunately. Um, that we know based on looking at newspapers that there were clearly radio stations that covered a few games here and there, but they don't seem to have been, at least to what we know today, they don't seem to have been preserved,
Yeah.
or at least they haven't been found yet. Same thing with film cover, like movie coverage and things. There's not much of that either.
Well,
Again, the
can't
Library of
imagine why,
Congress
right?
has some film footage, um, that you can watch, but unfortunately, again, it's minimal. Um, and so that is one area where we're sadly lacking. But just to point out, when I say in some ways, it may just be there could be more of it out there that we just haven't found yet. Just
Hmm.
a couple of years ago, um, there was film footage found of some black baseball players playing plantation baseball in 1918 and 1919,
Oh wow.
which we now believe is the earliest footage we've ever seen. The newest issue of Blackball, which is the journal that I edit, it's coming out next month, hopefully, has an article about that written by the archivist who was responsible for trying to date that film. And they dated it because if you're familiar with politics, the name Mark Hanna, maybe Mark Hanna was
Mm,
involved in the Republican Party when Teddy Roosevelt was. And so Mark Hanna from Cleveland, it was his family's plantation.
interesting.
And so by dating the family history, you could date that film footage. And it's from, near as we can tell, 1919.
Wow. Have you seen that footage of John Donaldson?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, is that
Yeah.
amazing stuff?
Yep. Yep. And that's, you wish there was more. And so
Oh.
by the fact that they found this film footage, it's now at the University of Georgia Media Archives on a old home movies,
Mm-hmm.
spliced in with all these other. So if you,
Very cool.
they found that just in the last couple of years, what's to say there isn't more of that out there
I know,
in
right?
places that you wouldn't expect to find it.
That's right, and that's why I keep putting it out there. It's everywhere. You
Uh-huh.
don't know. It could be in your local library, could be in
Well,
your grandmother's attic for all you know, right? I
the
mean,
Ethel Manley papers that the Newark Public Library now has, those were found in the attic of an abandoned building, and they were getting ready to tear it. And they called, I can't remember who now exactly the name of the person who found them, but they were smart enough to call the Newark Public Library and say, "We think there's something here that you want to come get."
wow,
I mean, I have
wow.
that's the good story.
Uh-huh.
A number of years back when I was in grad school, when I was working on, here's the I had tracked down the name of the owner of one of the Toledo black teams. His name was Hank Rigney. And so I tracked down his wife and I called her. And unfortunately, when I called her, she told me that if I had been 3 days earlier in calling her, she would have been able to give me all his filing cabinets full of, but she had been cleaning house and decided it was time to downsize since her husband had passed away. And she had taken it all, they had taken it all to the dump and it was gone.
Oh
And all
no.
she had left was one box, which she gave me.
What was in
And when
it?
I saw what was in there, I was like, oh my God, I can't imagine what was in the rest of
What was in
it.
the box?
It was, he had, she had kept mostly promotional pieces from, he was also, some people may remember this, back in the 40s, 30s, and 40s, there were a couple of three-man softball teams, the King and his Court.
Oh,
Rigney
Eddie
was
Feiner. I used to go see
well,
him all the time when I
Rigney
was a
was
kid.
he was one of the promoters,
Hmm.
and so a lot of the stuff was related to his involvement with the king in his court. So I would say about half the stuff was related to that, and about the other half
Wow.
was correspondence with various teams as he tried to set up games for the Toledo Crawfords.
Very cool. Toledo Crawfords. Very
Yeah,
cool. Boy, oh boy, that's too bad.
yeah, it was. I was like,
But like you
when she
said,
told me that,
maybe.
I was like, I almost wish you hadn't told me that.
Oh boy, right? Well, like you said, I mean, there's no telling.
So,
Hopefully, as people keep at this and you get the word out, and people can at least now be aware that you never know where you might step on something that
yep.
might be significant in all of this. So you don't you have not just done work on women's baseball history, Negro League history. You're a New York Mets fan.
Yes, that is correct.
So those two that you did on the '86 World Series, the Red Sox and Mets, I'm
Hmm.
sure. What can you tell us about your Met fan history?
Well, I grew up in even though I live in Ohio now, I did grow up in New York. So I come by it honestly, as I always say. My dad was a huge baseball fan. He played in college, but he was a Yankee fan. Um, I just remember as a little kid um, thinking that George Steinbrenner was an evil man, and therefore I didn't want to watch the Yankees.
Uh-huh.
So the
You
Mets
were
were my
probably
other
weren't the only
choice.
one who thought that, yeah.
Probably not, but that was, and
Unless you were a Yankee
so
fan.
yeah, and so I been a Mets fan for as long as I can remember. I was in college in '86 when they won the World Series, and um, I ran cross country when I was in college, and we had cross country practice during one of the games, and I brought, this will date me, young people today won't, my transistor radio with my headphones out,
Uh-huh.
and we were practicing on an old golf course, and I had to convince my coach to let me bring the radio out, and I hung it on a tree so that every time I came back, I could listen to it, and then I'd go do what he needed me, and I would so I could listen to the World Series when they were playing in
Oh my
'86,
God, that's funny.
and they won the game, and I'm out there in the middle of the golf course screaming, yelling. As the rest of them all thought I was crazy, but it's the only way I could listen to them while I was had to go to practice as well.
So,
So,
so what do
uh,
you write about in your what you wrote about between
well,
the Red Sox and
the
Mets?
80 the '86 series was Bill Nowlin, who's a Sabre member. He's a Sabre board member. Has written more books about Boston Red Sox history than any other person in the world. And we were just talking one day. We thought, wouldn't it be really fun to write a book on that series to look at the Red Sox side of it and the Mets side of it that whole year and then
Ah,
the World Series. So that's what we did. And so I took care of the New York Mets part. He took care of the Red Sox part.
cool.
And we just thought it would be a fun thing to, because that's always for a lot of people that, for not just Mets and Red Sox fans, but that for a lot of people that, particularly the playoffs in the World Series, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody remembers it, everybody. So we thought it would be fun to really take a look at how that all came about. And of course, if you're a Mets fan, that '86 Mets team was
It was fun.
quite the team. Quite the
It
team.
was. It was.
they
Yes.
had they were an interesting group,
Mm-hmm.
and some really good ball players on there. So it was a lot of fun to write
I
that
bet.
particular
I bet.
and to edit, because we didn't do all the writing, other people helped, but it was a fun idea that we came up with to do that. But
Absolutely.
most of my writing on the Mets has been about the ownership of the Mets,
Oh, okay.
particularly Joan Payson, because Joan Payson is among female owners rather unique. She's one of the only. I can't 100% say she's the only one. I want to, but whenever you say that, you know you're going to get. So I
Mm-hmm.
say she's one of most female owners, particularly of major league teams, have always inherited it, either
Mm-hmm.
from their father or a brother or some male relative. Joan Payson, of course, bought the Mets with her own money and ran them. Her husband wasn't really all that interested in baseball at all. And so this was something she did, and that makes her pretty unique.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, she's the first owner, right from '62 all the way through. She sees them win the World Series, gets them
Mm-hmm.
back into the play. So she sees them from '62, though
Mm-hmm.
one of the
Worst.
worst teams
Yes.
ever in Major League Baseball history, and then 8 years later, 7 years later in '69, they get to win the World Series.
Hmm. Very
And so
cool.
she sees them through that whole thing. So that's mostly what I've written about for the Mets
Cool.
is
And so where
her.
can you find those? Is that through Saber? Do you
Yeah, those are all on
no?
the Sabre website.
Okay. And you said you're going to be working on putting up a website of your own. Let me know.
Yes, I
Yeah.
am.
All right.
It'll be done later this summer.
Awesome. Good. 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 That's a good step. I think you should do that. You
Yes,
have a lot of
I was
content.
convinced that I needed
Yeah.
to pull all this stuff together in one place.
Yeah, I think it's great. What's your take on the Mets? I'm a Phillies fan. I have been my entire life. So,
I'm
I
sorry.
I know, right? It's oh boy, when I
Mets
think
fans,
back,
Phillies fans.
I know, especially growing up. I mean, I had some good times in the '70s and early '80s when I was a kid.
I was like
Playing
Mike
Little League.
Schmidt. I can say
Yeah,
that much good about the Phillies.
he was one of my favorite players. That 1980 team to me with Bake McBride and Gary Maddox
Hmm.
and it
Oh
running
yeah, I
trio,
liked
that
Gary
was just
Maddox
so
too.
much fun. But this year,
Oh,
the Mets have been
the
playing
Mets
pretty
have been in.
well. Yeah,
Well, they're in. I mean, they've solidly stayed in first place, even with all the
injury.
typical. The difference this. I mean, the last few years, there's been so many years where everybody's before the season started on paper said Mets have the best pitching staff, and let's look this, and then the injuries just devastate them.
Hmm.
Well, they've had the injuries again this year. I mean, at one point we had 17 players on the injured list,
Hmm.
every starter except Francisco Lindor.
Hmm.
Um, and yet they managed to find a way to win.
Hmm.
And that makes them kind of exciting. And
Yeah.
yes, they're very dependent on a couple of players. And one of those, obviously, is Jake DeGrom.
Hmm.
Um, there's,
Not much
don't know
more you
what
can say
what
about that.
words you
Yeah.
can say about except to
Historical
say,
season so far. Yeah.
and he's had historical seasons already. So to say
Hmm.
that it's just phenomenal watching him pitch.
Hmm.
I um, but he's got a pretty decent, Stroman is finally pitching the way we thought he would when we got him.
Hmm.
Walker has been an unexpected surprise. Even Peterson pitched a superb game yesterday.
Yes, I saw that against the Cubs. Yeah.
He finally,
Hmm.
and it's like, okay, maybe and Seth Lugo's back. So Familia's pitching like he did a couple years ago.
As a Philadelphia sports fan, um, the highlights are few and far between many times, but it's always they find ways to suck you back in. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like this year, I'm hoping the 76ers can get over what happened yesterday. But anyway, the it just seems like right when you think that they're over the hump, you're back down again, and
Yep.
somehow it seems the Mets, kind of been the Mets experience over the years though
Yes.
too, hasn't it? I mean,
It's an up and down ride.
oh boy, and but you know what, you got to love it. That's what
Oh,
makes
it's what makes baseball so
yeah,
much fun
boy,
and so frustrating.
that to me, that up and down, baseball is a marathon, not a
Yes.
sprint. So when I read some people and some of these articles talking about, oh, this team is, they're terrible. They lost, three of the last four. It's like, okay, so what, we're in June.
Yeah. It's a long season, people.
Relax. It's a marathon, and yes, you got to look at it in these little short sprints. They add up over time, but I think the
Yeah.
Mets are in
Well,
good shape this year. So
the Mets won in '69 with a huge comeback, right? How many
that's right.
games out of
You
first place
you
were
never
they?
know.
And
You never
so,
know. So this was a lot of fun. This is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here. I know you probably got a busy schedule yourself. There's a lot going on. So you teach at what university?
I teach at Kent State.
Kent State. That's right. And
Mhm.
you said it actually is baseball history.
Well, I teach history, and as a consequence, I do teach a sports history class. I teach a Negro League history class. I've taught a baseball and literature class, so I do get to do that.
So what students are signing up for these classes? Are they electives? Is there
Um, they
a
work as
program?
they work for both just straightforward history majors, and then I get a lot of students who just take them as electives.
Because many colleges now have got the analytics, as you can actually take
Right.
that as a program now, and I would imagine some of these things would tie into. I would think
Sure.
analytics people need to take these classes, honestly,
I would
because
agree, but
because because to me, I think analytics is great in its context. However, it's not the entire game, and
right.
numbers are not telling the whole story. You need to have
You got to
the.
put the two people.
You do.
In fact, Larry Lester and I were just having this conversation yesterday, as a matter of fact, the necessity to be able to put the
Hmm.
statistics. So all of this stuff that's been happening and what Baseball Reference and CMADs and that's great. But by themselves, they're not enough, just
No.
like the stories are not enough,
Hmm.
because the statistics allow you to corroborate and give people concrete things to look at. So we can
Hmm.
say, did Josh Gibson actually hit 900 home runs?
Hmm.
Well, let's see if we can figure that out. It's a great
Hmm.
story, but what's
Hmm.
the truth behind that
Hmm.
story? Doesn't take anything away from the story because there's a reason that story exists. But you need both sides. You need all of
You
those
do.
pieces together. And so that's what I like about what Baseball Reference did with the release of the stats, but
Uh-huh.
also the articles. And then they're doing a series of podcasts that they had a number of us do as well to talk further. So they're trying to put those two pieces and to marry those two pieces together.
Awesome. And like I said, that's what I'm kind of trying to do here is get
Yeah.
you in front of and other authors and researchers, and I'm going to have Scott Simkus is going to be on here in a couple of
Oh,
weeks,
great.
and I've got a number of other researchers, authors lined up. I've had a number on already, and all of that is just great context. Besides the fact it gets people aware of what you guys have been doing, many of you for such a long time, and I think it's great. I mean, without all the people who made all these efforts all these years, maybe some of these things wouldn't be even as far along as they are. I think it's commendable. You
Well,
guys are
thank
great.
you.
You guys are great. So, anything else you wanted to add before we sign off? Like I said, I appreciate you taking the time. This was a
Well,
lot
I
of
just
fun.
wanted to say thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation immensely, and I really
Awesome.
appreciate the opportunity to come on and have this chat with you. I can talk baseball,
Me
particularly Negro
too.
League Baseball, anytime anybody wants.
I told Phil Dixon. He we did it later in the evening, and I told him, man, I could talk with him. I could talk to him till the sun. I could talk to you guys till the sun comes up and goes down again about baseball and baseball history. I just think it's just fascinating and a lot of fun, and I get carried away sometimes too. But what I like about these is like I said, we're not trying to jam.
Yeah,
Into like a time slot of 7 minutes, and you only have so many topics you can cover,
yep, I've done a
and
lot of those.
what yeah, I bet, right? And the one thing I would think that would be, I don't want to say frustrating because it's just great to get out there and be able to do these things, but um, many times I bet people aren't even really hearing your answer, right? I mean, they're probably
Well, yeah,
they're looking for the next question already without even really knowing what it is
yeah,
you just said.
yeah, because there's not a lot, there's
It's
not
the
enough
format.
time, and
It's
it's
the
just the
format.
nature of the format,
Yeah.
and I get that, and so
Hmm.
I'm happy to take the opportunities where the opportunities come to
That's right.
tell people these stories, and hopefully, as
Yeah.
I said to a group yesterday, to pique their interest, and maybe then they'll go out and want to learn more themselves.
There you go, right? Because there's more out
Oh, there's
there
so much more.
that you could dig into, and like we've been talking about, you know, turn
Mm-hmm.
around. Maybe in your own local library, there might be some things, or in your own hometown, there might be something that you didn't even know
Yep.
was there. We've had on authors and artists and other people over the last couple of months doing this, and it's interesting how many were not aware of a lot of this. And then when they did start doing a little bit of digging, they found out, wow, in my own hometown, we had this stadium, or we had this player, or we had whatever.
Right.
And
Yep.
that is what's really, really fun about it, is kind of getting people to become aware of this great story that's out there that for many, many years, not not enough people were telling it. so
Exactly.
so I like I said, I appreciate it. This was great. When you have your website, maybe we can. When are you planning on getting that thing wrapped up?
Oh, hopefully, well, before school starts.
Okay,
I need to
good,
get it up
awesome.
and running
Well,
before,
maybe
so sometime this summer.
awesome. Well, maybe down the road, we get into the fall, we can have you back on here again, and we can showcase your website and talk more about some of the other things that you've done as well. I think that would be a lot of fun.
That'd be great. That'd be fun.
All right, Leslie, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You have
Thank
a
you
good
so
one.
much, Philip. I appreciate it. Take care.
All right, bye bye.
Bye.